This video will contain analysis, discussion, and portrayals of anxiety and panic attacks, as well as spoilers for the first Paw Patrol movie, The Owl House, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, Andi Mack, The Spider Within: A Spider-Verse Story, and Inside Out 2. Viewer discretion is advised. Panic attacks are defined as sudden periods of intense fear and discomfort and are typically accompanied by a number of physical symptoms, oftentimes including heart palpitations, hyperventilating, shaking, chest pain, and dizziness, among a number of other possible symptoms. They are different than heart attacks in the sense that you are in no physical danger from them, but the symptoms can often mimic that of a heart attack. If you think you may be experiencing a heart attack, please get yourself to the hospital if you have the means to do so. There is some debate over whether or not panic attacks are the same thing as anxiety attacks. In my brain, the difference is that anxiety attacks are based on a buildup of stress, whereas panic attacks are more sudden or based on a specific trigger, so that's how I'll use those terms in this video, but again, these are loose definitions and no one can seem to actually agree on what the difference is, if there's any to begin with. When it comes to fictional media, there are a number of depictions of panic attacks coming from shows and movies geared toward general or older audiences. Supergirl and BoJack Horseman are just two examples off the top of my head. If I wanted to, I could randomly pick out a few of those and analyze them. However, I am far more interested in looking at depictions from children's media. For this video, I have compiled 6 scenes from various pieces of media geared towards younger audiences. What these source materials are ranges a fair bit, but the one thing they all have in common is that they contain depictions of panic attacks, or at least a panic attack. For each clip, I will be looking at what triggered the attacks, how these episodes are portrayed, how the characters got out of said episodes, and what functions these scenes serve for the story and or the younger audiences watching. Now, please do not mistake my words for review of these scenes or the source material as a whole. I do not seek to analyze whether a scene or source material is good or bad, and am far more interested simply in analyzing these portrayals and how they may help educate a younger audience who's maybe never had a panic attack before. I do not care to go into the debate of whether or not these scenes are becoming overdone or if they're Oscar bait or anything like that. I frankly do not care, and ultimately I think it's important that kids be educated and presented with more difficult topics from an early age so that they can better understand themselves and their emotions, as well as have more empathy for any friends or classmates of theirs who may struggle with mental health issues. And finally, I would also like to state that I do have a pretty in-depth history with these sorts of things due to a number of mental issues I have personally struggled and continue to struggle with. I promise I'm not just talking out of my ass here. Now, without further ado, let's look at our first example. Paw Patrol, the movie, is the first movie adaptation of the popular children's show Paw Patrol, which follows a rescue team consisting of puppies with various jobs, and is led by a young human boy named Ryder. Pretty much every episode of the show revolves around some kind of rescue mission, initially utilizing one or two of the dogs based on whatever the terrain and situation is, but often then including the others once conflict inevitably comes up. Because this is the source material, it makes plenty of sense that, while the movie does have a broader plotline that spans across the entire film, a lot of the movie consists of individual rescue missions. It's during one of these that we get our first scene we'll be looking at, as Chase, who is broadly a police officer, but more specifically is just supposed to be a traffic cop, according to the early episodes of the show, has an anxiety attack while trying to rescue some people. So, what caused this? His whole thing is rescuing people, and they've all been doing this for years, so it can't just be that he didn't know what to do and freaked out. Well, notably, This takes place in a location called Adventure City, and it's been established in this film that Chase has trauma from that place. He had been stressed the entire time, and it all just culminated here, which makes sense because this is already a sort of high-stress situation. We see that, for him, everything seems to slow down as his anxiety increases.
I can do this.
We get a vertigo effect when he looks down, similar to what they did in The Last of Us Part 2 to show Abby's fear of heights. His breathing gets faster, and there's the sound of a heartbeat heard over the ambience. He backs up and leans against the wall, and we see his eyes darting back and forth for a moment. He seemingly manages to calm himself down most of the way while the rest of the Paw Patrol finishes the rescue mission, because when Skye finally comes to check on him, we see this little moment where he snaps back into reality and he's no longer showing the more physical symptoms of his attack.
Chase! I'm coming out to get you!
This is one of the more grounded examples that we'll be looking at in this video. Sure, there are certain visual tricks that one would not literally see in real life, meant to better communicate how he feels to the audience, but the episode itself is not shown through metaphor or anything of the sort, like some of the examples we'll cover later. There are pros and cons to both ways of portraying this, but again, I'm not here to say whether or not a scene is good, because that's not the point. To a child watching this scene, they may not necessarily walk away with specific terminology or coping skills for this sort of thing, but I don't think that that is strictly necessary. Sure, this is for kids, but it's also a story beat, not a PSA, and it is meant mainly to show how Chase was affected by his trauma and plant the seeds for when Ryder later blocks him from helping on missions later on in the movie.
We'll take care of the rescues for a while.
What? No, that's not fair!
Additionally, if a child who saw this movie were to later experience something similar, they're at least less likely to feel crazy because they saw this on screen before. Season 2 of Disney Channel animated series The Owl House introduces us to a character initially only known as the Golden Guard. His real identity is later revealed to be that of a boy named Hunter, first introduced as a powerless witch, and later learned to be a Grimwalker, which is essentially a clone of someone who has already died, in this instance a boy named Caleb Wittebane. I know that's a lot of lore to get thrown at you if you haven't seen the series, but it is important context for the first scene we'll be going over here. And yes, I do mean the first. Within this series, we actually see Hunter go through 2 on-screen panic attacks, and I will be analyzing both of those scenes. The first scene happens in Season 2, Episode 16. Hunter has just learned the truth about his origins, but that's not what sets him off. No, what sets him off is the realization that Bellows, his evil and abusive uncle whom he lives with, knows that he has learned this, and would most likely kill him if they crossed paths again. Because of this, Hunter has nowhere to go and feels extremely unsafe, which makes him begin to panic. Now is probably a good time to mention that, while it's never explicitly said in the series, it's made very clear that Hunter has pretty severe CPTSD from the repeated abuse from Bellows, as well as the numerous other traumas he endures throughout the series. I bring this up because when Ida, a friendly witch who just wants to help him calm down, reaches out her hand to him, he backs away in a panic and then runs out of the house. I haven't brought up the concept of the fight, flight, freeze response yet, but the fight, flight, freeze response is what your brain does whenever you are in a high-stress situation. It's meant to protect you from danger, but in the case of panic attacks, it tends to get triggered even when there isn't actually any danger present. With the Paw Patrol scene, we got a clear example of the freeze response, with Chase freezing up and pretty much just shutting down due to his panic. And with this, we see the flight response, with Hunter bolting bolting out of the titular owl house. Keep this in mind when watching scenes like this because it can give a lot of insight on the character and adds an extra layer of realism to the scenes. Anyways, what we see in this scene is that when Hunter panics, he tends to talk a lot higher, and his breathing is very labored.
He knows we were in there. I can't go back!
He also rips off the cloak that he's wearing, likely because it's a very clear reminder of his trauma. As for how he calms down from this, we don't actually see that. He most likely either managed to calm himself down, his pet bird helped him calm down, or the adrenaline exhausted his brain and body enough to make it stop on its own. As for the second scene, that occurs 2 episodes later and is triggered by him learning that Emperor Belos, the aforementioned abusive uncle, is looking for him.
Oh, Titan! He's looking for me!
The physical symptoms are the same ones we saw in the previous scene, with his voice getting high and frantic, and his breathing becoming labored.
I gotta run! I gotta hide! I gotta...
But the key difference here is that he doesn't run. Instead, he sits down and listens to Gus's breathing instructions, which helps him calm back down. This example is notable because it very clearly gives a breathing technique that can be helpful for shutting down panic attacks and just generally helping with anxiety.
Try to breathe. Like this.
The attack itself is shown plainly as it would occur if this was real life, and there are no visual tricks or anything of the sort to more artfully show what he's going through. Again, one could make pro and con lists for either approach, but the more grounded and realistic portrayal, along with the inclusion of a real grounding technique, could prove helpful to someone watching, especially if they are younger or haven't dealt with something like that before. And because he's also helped by a friend, it could also encourage audience members to try and help others who they see dealing with something like this. On a story level, this also once again helps to emphasize how deeply he was affected by his trauma, something that could be missed by younger audiences who maybe wouldn't pick up on some of the subtler moments surrounding it. In 2011, DreamWorks released a spin-off film based on the Shrek series, following fan-favorite feline Puss in Boots. The movie was deeply mid and very forgettable. Over a full decade later, they came out with a sequel entitled Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, a beautiful masterpiece of a film with some of the most impressive animation of the CG era, rivaled only by Across the Spider-Verse, and a very poignant movie about pride, trust, and mortality. I don't know what the DreamWorks writers snort whenever they write these sequels, but please, keep snorting it, guys. Anyways, it is in this film that we find our third example for this video. Puss in Boots, who I'm just going to call Boots for the sake of brevity, is sitting in a bar enjoying a glass of milk when he first meets the wolf, who initially introduces himself to be a bounty hunter. They have a short battle, and then, for the first time in his life, Boots gets scratched by his opponent, and this absolutely breaks him. He's always thought of himself as invincible. After all, he's an amazing fighter, and, more notably, cats have 9 lives, but as it turns out, he's been taking those for granted, and now he's on his last life, face to face with the concept that he could actually properly die. This scares him so badly that he goes straight into retirement, mourning the loss of who he once was and resigning himself to life as a miserable house cat, something which he absolutely hates but is too scared and depressed to break free from. After all, it seems like this is what is best for him. He should be gentle with this life of his, now that he only has one. Long story short, he eventually takes back up the name of the myth, the legend, Puss in Boots, and begins to go on an adventure, accompanied by his love interest, a badass lady cat by the name of Kitty Softpaws, and a cheery dog named Perito, who has dreams of becoming a therapy dog. While they are on this adventure, he keeps being haunted by the vision of the wolf. In fact, it's not entirely clear how many of these sightings are real, or just his imagination, but nonetheless, they're very real to him, and this eventually leads to the scene we're here to talk about. In the midst of a battle, all the sound cuts out except for a high-pitched tinnitus-type noise, a very direct representation of how anxiety and panic attacks can affect hearing for some people. And the wolf appears once more. All of Boots' fur stands up, and he goes with the flight response, bolting away from everyone else in an attempt to outrun the wolf that he's sure is following him. His expression is very clearly one of fear, and as he's running, there's a sort of VHS blur effect to all of his surroundings, again, to communicate how he's feeling in a direct visual way. We also see him getting these little flashes of the wolf in different places, implying that this may even be a sort of PTSD episode as opposed to just a regular panic attack. After all, his initial encounter with the wolf was definitely traumatizing to him, so it makes sense. Perito eventually finds him lying against a tree, hyperventilating as a heartbeat is heard over the rest of the audio. When Perito speaks, his voice is muffled and Boots doesn't even look at him.
Puss, what's wrong?
Boots doesn't start to calm down until Perito, who, again, dreams of being a therapy dog, rests his head on Boots' stomach to help ground him. After this, Boots just pats the dog's head and we watch in real time as his panic attack ends. While this scene does utilize a lot of audio and visual tricks to show how our protagonist is feeling, it is once again a very grounded portrayal of this sort of thing, and also shows how animals can be of help in such situations. There's a reason so many soldiers have service dogs, after all. This is definitely a much more visceral depiction of a panic attack than, like, the Paw Patrol movie, but it perfectly fits with the overall maturity this film carries with it, so it works out fine nonetheless, and it is one of the many things that young audiences can take away from this film. After all, if the cool, brave Puss in Boots deals with this sort of thing, then kids who saw this may be less likely to think lowly of themselves if they deal with something like this in the future. And we see that he's okay in the end, so they may also be less inclined to fear that it's a heart attack or anything along those lines. This next example is notable for being the only live-action example in this video. Additionally, this is the one example in this video where I haven't actually watched the show or even the full episodes that these scenes, again plural, are from. Thankfully though, this is also an example that isn't related to pre-existing trauma, at least as far as I can tell, so context from the show as a whole probably isn't all that important anyhow. Andi Mack is a Disney Channel show that ran from 2017 to 2019 and is probably most known for having one of Disney's many quote-unquote first gay characters. As far as I can tell, the first scene of relevance, as well as the first time that our character of interest, Jonah, experiences a panic attack, occurs about mid to late season 2. We see him walking out of a building, breathing heavily, and every time he turns to look somewhere, we see a slowed down and blurry shot from his point of view. It's not clear from this clip alone what triggered this or how he calmed himself down, but we have plenty of other scenes for that. He says something upset him, but he won't elaborate on what.
Did something upset you or make you anxious?
Yeah, kind of.
You want to talk about it?
The next scene starts with him rushing into a music store, or maybe a classroom, I can't entirely tell. Either way, we once again see that he's breathing heavily and generally seems jittery, but the adult with him handles the situation well, and helps him calm down by distracting him with guitar.
Are you okay?
I just ran here, so
You're good.
I needed to buy guitar.
Yeah, I didn't know you played. It's a D.
It's in this scene that it also becomes clear that Jonah has some sort of panic disorder.
Jonah, that kind of sounds like panic attack.
Yeah, I really don't want to keep having them, but I guess it doesn't matter what I want.
This is a thing that a lot of people of all ages deal with, so it's beneficial to their audience, especially those who are younger and more impressionable, that they show a main character dealing with this and not being judged or made fun of for it. Our next scene is notable because it's the only example I could find where we actually see the start of one of his panic attacks. They are not completely random, which we already knew, but it's still definitely a disordered reaction to moderate stressors. His friends are arguing, and then the pancakes they're making start burning, and that's enough to send him into another panic attack, once again primarily just characterized by him hyperventilating. He tells his friends what's happening, and then we get a cut, so we don't actually see how he calms down, but his friends presumably just talked him down. Afterwards, we see him telling them that what just happened wasn't actually a panic attack, and obviously I'm not in this fictional child's mind, but I'm pretty sure he was just, wrong. He displays the same symptoms here that we saw from him in previous scenes, and again, this isn't a typical reaction to moderate stress. Neither of his friends were panicking, it was just him. Prior to this, he's avoided telling his friends about this issue of his, but it's important that they do know, both because that's just kind of an important thing to know about someone you're spending a lot of time with, so you don't misinterpret a panic attack as being something far more serious, but also because it sets up the fourth and final scene we will be looking at from this particular series. This scene is our only Season 3 example, and once again starts off-screen. We start by seeing his friend Cyrus trying to figure out where he went, only to find him in a room by himself having a panic attack. While maybe a bit more intense in tone than the situation calls for, Cyrus manages to talk Jonah down, and we see him calm down quickly after, before reflecting on his condition and realizing that this is probably a permanent thing.
I don't think they're ever going to be over. I haven't had a panic attack in a while. I even stopped worrying about them, and this one, it just came out of nowhere.
None of these scenes are the most in-depth look at panic attacks, and we don't really have any coping skills you can learn from them or anything like that, but it is still beneficial to kids watching, if for no other reason than the fact that it's recurring. This isn't a very special episode that one could easily miss. This is a main character who struggles with recurring panic attacks as a result of an unspecified anxiety or panic disorder. It's also not even the chief thing about this character. Again, there are 3 seasons of this show, and there's only 4 of these scenes that I could find at least, so it's not like Jonah is just the anxious character with nothing else going for him. It's a very humanized example of someone struggling with such a condition, and that can surely help kids feel less alone, as well as just educating kids in general about panic attacks, if in a very limited way. This next example contains a lot of spiders, so if that bothers you, there are timestamps in the description, or you can skip to the time on screen. The Spider Within, a Spider-Verse story, is a short film that takes place in between Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and is definitely the most public service announcement-y of the examples in this video. This is because, well, it kind of is a public service announcement, being a collaboration between Sony and the Kevin Love Fund, an organization meant to educate about mental and physical health. If you go on their website, they even have a whole lesson about mental health designed around this short film. So, yeah, it's a PSA. However, it's not nearly as corny as a lot of other PSAs centering on popular children's characters.
But if someone tries to touch you in a place or in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's no good.
Miles never turns to the camera and talks to the audience or anything like that, and it still works on its own as a short film, so let's talk about it. In the beginning of the short, we see that Miles has a lot on his mind, both from his life as Miles and his life as Spider-Man, and it's here that we can pinpoint that this is most likely the cause of his anxiety attack, a buildup of stress that he's clearly not been coping with properly. When he gets home, his dad plays a harmless prank prank on him, but this startle sets off Miles's spider senses, and definitely doesn't help with the ongoing stress. He retreats up to his room, and we see that he's breathing heavily. His spider senses are set off by nothing, which is a very clear way of conveying the false alarm, fight, flight, freeze response that is typical of anxiety and panic attacks. Miles tries to decompress by listening to music, something which he does consistently throughout both of the Spider-Verse movies, but this time it doesn't work, and his thoughts are still racing. He tries lying down, and we see that his breathing is a lot quicker now, and that's when he sees this. From there, we get an abstract sequence of him facing off with this Shadow Miles and then against a giant spider. And it all comes to a head with him being covered with hundreds, maybe thousands of spiders crawling all over his skin and even in his mouth. Spiders that, of course, are not real and are instead most likely meant to be an abstract representation of his many racing thoughts, alongside maybe a visual portrayal of him feeling like his skin is crawling, a symptom that some people may experience while having an anxiety or panic attack. He curls up in the corner of his room, the attack seemingly ends on its own, and then we get the most PSA feeling part of this PSA, where he goes downstairs and tells his dad that he needs fresh air. The film ends with him talking out some of his stress to his dad as they take a walk together. Considering that this short was made specifically to educate about panic attacks, it is interesting that it's also presented in such an abstract way, but it still gets the point across, which is ultimately that you should talk to someone if you're feeling stressed. Plus, again, this film is meant to be accompanied with a whole lesson, so students would presumably still be getting more realistic information about panic attacks anyways. This, even more than some of our other examples, is also beneficial to children because Spider-Man is quite literally a superhero. If a superhero can have a panic attack, then kids are more likely to be kinder to themselves and their peers about any mental health issues that may come up. Even extending past just anxiety, because the presentation of this particular example could read as a number of other things, such as schizophrenia, even though that was not the original intention. All that brings us to our final example for this video, as well as the most recent in terms of release date, Inside Out 2. Coming out almost a decade after the original, Pixar's Inside Out 2 is the long-awaited sequel to Inside Out, which follows a young girl named Riley and the personified emotions in her head. In addition to the emotions showed in the first movie, those being joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust, Inside Out 2 introduces 4 new emotions, being envy, ennui, embarrassment, and, most relevant to this video, anxiety, voiced by Maya Hawke, who's probably most known for her role as Robin in Stranger Things.
It isn't because I had a crush on you. It's because she wouldn't stop staring at you.
The plot revolves around Riley's struggle with anxiety as she gets ready to go into high school. This struggle as a whole is something I'd gladly make a video on if there's interest for that, but for the sake of this video, I will just focus on the climax of it. It should come as little surprise that the climax of a plot about anxiety would be, well, the main character experiencing an anxiety attack. This is nothing revolutionary. Just off the top of my head, The Perks of Being a Wallflower and Pink Skies Ahead also did this. However, this is the first example I've seen at least where a children's movie has done this, hence why we're talking about it. Anxiety, the character, has been building up a new sense of self for Riley throughout the movie to better help her fit in with her new cool high school friends. Anxiety thinks she's doing the right thing. However, she realizes too late that she messed up when the new sense of self forms as the phrase, "I'm not good enough." From there, anxiety quickly starts to spiral, and the influx of emotions leads to Riley acting out in her hockey game, leading to her being dropped into the penalty box. And this is when the anxiety attack starts. For Riley, this is represented with the expected physical symptoms, hyperventilating, sweating, fidgeting, just another variant of what we've talked about throughout this video. For the character of anxiety, though, This is seen as her rapidly going back and forth across the control panel, a visual representation of Riley's anxiety growing out of control, and eventually leading to an orange electric tornado of anxiety around the control panel. When Joy bravely goes into the tornado, everything is eerily quiet, as tends to be the case with real storms, and she tries to tackle the rogue emotion, only to find she goes right through her. Anxiety is moving so quickly that, even though to us she looks like she's just standing there, really, she's still running back and forth, just so quickly that it tricks the eye, much like that of super speedy superheroes like the Flash. Joy, who's been quite unempathetic to anxiety throughout the entire film, tries scolding the emotion, but that doesn't work. It's only when she shows concern for anxiety that she breaks through the fear a little bit, and we see a single tear roll down anxiety's face. Eventually, Joy manages to talk down anxiety just enough to get her away from the panel, but it's not until Riley's identity issue is properly fixed that she begins to calm down. This example is important because it's possibly the most relatable to children. The majority of kids watching probably don't have PTSD or a panic disorder, or would even see something like The Spider Within, but pretty much everyone deals with some anxiety during the transitions between levels of school or with fitting in, and at the time of writing this, Inside Out 2 is also the highest grossing animated movie of all time. Riley is just like every other teenager, and that's what makes this story and this scene so helpful to children. The relatability of it, and that is the last example I'd like to go over in this video. So, that's all fine and dandy, but what's the point? There's countless panic attack scenes out there. Why is it so important that kids are exposed to this? Well, like I've said numerous times, it's good that kids are exposed to these concepts at an early age because it's something that could happen to anyone. Even if you don't have a mental disorder that increases the frequency of panic attacks, anyone could still struggle with this if the stress is bad enough, regardless of whether you're a superhero or a normal kid. Kids are just as capable of dealing with these sorts of things as adults are, so it's good to be aware of it. Besides, even if one kid who sees these scenes never deals with anything of the sorts, chances are they'll have a friend or a classmate who does, and empathy is important in that case. If a child understands what's happening when they see the quiet kid in their class freaking out in the corner, then they're better able to help or at least be there for that kid, whereas they otherwise may react with judgment or something else along those lines out of a lack of understanding. You can call scenes like this Oscar bait or whatever, and there are criticisms one could make for all of these scenes on their own, but ultimately, if one child feels less alone because of it, even if the presentation was done in a clunky manner, then that's a positive thing, in my opinion. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. This is definitely one of the longest video essays I've ever made. I'm not sure exactly how long this video will end up being, but if it's over 30 minutes, then it will be the longest video essay that I've made to date. I want to do more long-form video essays like this when I can, so if you enjoyed this, please do like, subscribe, and or comment so that I know. For those who are unaware, this is a new channel, that way the people from my main channel who subscribed for my video essays don't have to deal with the inbox clog of my other content. These are my favorite videos to make, but they're also the most time consuming, so I'm hoping this new channel does well to balance that out. I'm not sure what the next one is going to be about, but I have a whole list of ideas to pick from, so if this channel gathers enough of a following, I'll start doing polls on the community tab and give y'all more of a choice on what I'm churning out. That's really all I have to say. Please stay hydrated and be nice to people because you never know what someone is going through. Also, now that we're at the end, I know I said this isn't a review, and it isn't, but just in case you were wondering, this is my personal opinionated ranking of all the examples we went over today. Okay, bye.